The book I'm going to read from this time is God's Smuggler, the story of Brother Andrew by the Sherrills. And I want to share this because it was one of the stories I read before I went on the mission field myself. And if you know anything about him, he was courageous, well, maybe not courageous, adventurous as a child and as a teenager. And then he really wanted adventure, and so he joined the army. He went to the war in Indonesia, and in Indonesia he got hurt. And so he always had a limp up until the time we find out more about him. And he didn't know what he could do. He was a man that just had a limp, and he figured that he could go places on his bike, but he could only pedal with one leg. So this is in Holland, just before the war started. His hometown was Witte, W-I-T-T-E. So I'm just going to start from there. If you want to read the beginning of his early life, then of course you can get the book or go online to Kindle. So by April, Witte was crowded with refugees from the polderland to the east of us. Holland was bombing its own dikes, deliberately flooding land wrested inch by inch from the sea over the centuries to slow down the German army. Every house except ours, which was too small, held a homeless family from the flooded land, and Mama's soup pot simmered night and day. But of course the Germans did not come by land. The first planes flew over Witte the night of May the 10th, 1940. We spent the night in the sitting room, huddled together, not sleeping. All the next day we saw planes and heard the explosions as they bombed the small military airfield 4 kilometers away. It was my 12th birthday, but neither I nor anyone else remembered. Then the Germans bombed Rotterdam. The radio announcer from Hilversum, to whom we had listened since mobilization, wept as he read the release. Rotterdam was gone. In 1 hour, a city had disappeared from the earth. This was the Blitzkrieg, the new warfare. The next day, Holland surrendered. A few days later, a fat little German lieutenant arrived in Witte in a squad car and set himself up in the burgomaster's house. The handful of soldiers who accompanied him were mostly older men. Witte was not important enough to rate crack troops. And for a while I really did act out my fantasies of resistance. Many was the night I crept barefoot down the ladder from the loft as 2 o'clock struck on the tower clock. I knew that my mother heard me because the regular rhythm of her breathing halted as I passed their room. But she never stopped me, nor did she ask the next morning what I'd been up to and what had happened to our precious highly rationed sugar. Everyone in the village was amused when the lieutenant's staff car began to give him trouble. His sparks were fouled, his engine stalled, and some said there was sugar in the lieutenant's gas tank. Others thought it was unlikely. Food ran out in the towns before it did in farming villages like ours, and this fact, too, I used in my child's war against the enemy. One hot day that first summer, I loaded a basket with cabbages and tomatoes and walked the 4 miles to Alkmaar. A store there still had a supply of pre-war fireworks, and I knew the proprietor wanted vegetables. I pressed my advantage as far as I could and filled my basket with the firecrackers, placing over them the flowers I'd brought along for the purpose. The proprietor stood looking at me in silence. Then with sudden resolution, he reached under the counter and brought up a large cherry bomb. "I have no more food for that." "You'd better get home before the curfew then." That night, back in Witte, the floorboards of the loft creaked again, and again Mama held her breath. I slipped out barefoot into the night. A patrol of 4 foot soldiers was moving northward, up the street toward our house, playing their torches on each of the buildings as they passed. I moved out of the doorway and flattened myself against the side of the house as the marching boots drew closer. The minute the soldiers had passed, I sped across the little bridge between our house and the dike road, and ran south to the burgomaster's house. It would have been a simple matter to fire the mammoth cherry bomb in the lieutenant's doorway, while the patrol was at the other end of the village. But I wanted more adventure than that. I was the fastest runner in the village, and I thought it would be fun to have these old men in their heavy boots run after me. I don't suppose any of them was over 50, but to my young eyes they seemed ancient. So I waited until the patrol began its tour back down the street, and just before they got to the headquarters, I lit the fuse and ran. "Halt!" A torch beam picked me up, and I heard a rifle bolt being drawn. I hadn't counted on guns. I zigged and I zagged as I ran up the street. Then the cherry bomb exploded, and for a fraction of a moment the soldiers' attention was diverted. I darted across the first bridge I could find, raced through the garden, and flung myself down among the cabbage heads. For nearly an hour they hunted for me, shouting gruff syllables to one another in German, until at last they gave up. Elated by this success, I began discharging volleys in broad daylight. One day I stepped from hiding straight into the arms of a soldier. To run was to admit guilt, yet in my hands was strong circumstantial evidence. In my left hand were firecrackers, in my right, matches. "Du, komm mal hier." My hands clenched around my firecrackers. I didn't dare stuff them in my pocket. That would surely be the first place he would look. "Hast du einen Verkehrsgruppe explodiert?" "Vorwärts? Oh, no, sir." I grabbed the two edges of my coat with my clenched hands and held it wide for him to search. The soldier went over me from my wide trousers to my cap. When he turned away in disgust, the firecrackers in my hand were drenched with perspiration. But as the occupation dragged on, even I tired of my games. In villages near ours, hostages were being lined up and shot, and houses burned to the ground. As the real resistance hardened and took shape, jokes against the Germans ceased to be funny. All over Holland were the Onderdikers, literally the underdivers, men and boys in hiding to escape deportation to the forced labor camps in Germany. Ben, 16 when the war began, dived under a farm near Emilo the first month, and for 5 years we had no news of him. Possession of a radio was made a crime against the new regime. We hid Mama's instrument in a crawl space under the sloping roof, and one by one we would crouch there to listen for the Dutch language broadcasts from England. Later, when the Dutch railroad struck, we would even squeeze railroad workers into that tiny hole. And, of course, there were always Jews to be hidden for a night on their way to the coast. As the Germans grew desperate for manpower, Whitty's tiny occupation force was withdrawn. Then came the dreaded razzia. Trucks would suddenly speed into the village at any hour of the day or the night, sealing the dike roads at both ends, while squads of soldiers searched every house for able-bodied men. Before I was 14, I was joining the flight of men and boys into the polders, or the floods, at the first sign of a German uniform. We would run across the fields, crouching low, leaping the canals, making for the swamp beyond the railroad. The railroad dike was too high to climb. We would surely be seen. So we would dive into the broad canal that flowed beneath the railroad bridge to crawl out, soaked, panting, and shivering. By the end of the war, even little Cornelius and Papa, deaf as he was, were joining the race to the swamp. Between the razzias, life was a somber struggle for mere existence. All electricity was reserved for the Germans. With nothing to power the pumps, the rainwater lay deep and stagnant over the polders. In our homes we used oil lamps, making the oil ourselves from cabbage seeds. There was no coal, so Whitty cut down its elms. The tree under which my brother Bus had stood for years was cut the second winter. But the chief enemy, worse even than the cold and the soldiers, was hunger. We were constantly, naggingly, endlessly hungry. All crops were commandeered for the front as soon as they were picked. My father tended his garden as carefully as ever, but it was the Germans who reaped most of the harvest. For years our family of 6 lived on rations for 2. At first we were able to add this allowance by digging the tulip bulbs from our garden and eating them like potatoes. Then even the tulips ran out. Mama would pretend to eat, but many nights I saw her divide her tiny portion among the other plates. Her only consolation was that my brother Bas had not lived to see this time. He never could have understood the ache in his stomach, the dark fireplace, and the treeless street. At last the day came when Mama could not get out of bed. If liberation didn't come soon, we knew she would die. And then in the spring of 1945, the Germans left and the Canadians took their place. People stood in the street weeping for joy, but I was not with them. I was running every step of the 5 miles to the Canadian encampment, where I was able to beg a small sackful of breadcrumbs. Bread, quite literally the bread of life. I brought it home to my family with shouts of food, food, food. As Mama gnawed the dry crust, tears of gratefulness to God rolled down the deep lines in her cheeks. The war was over. Chapter 2. One afternoon in the summer of 1945, several months after liberation, I came into the house and was met by my little sister Gertje with the news that my father wanted to see me. "He's in the garden," she said. I walked through the dark kitchen and out into the cabbage patch, blinking my eyes against the bright sunlight. Papa, hoe in his hand, clumping on his feet, was bent over his cabbages, working the little weeds out with patient tenderness. I circled so as to stand in front of him and shouted because he couldn't hear me very well. He was almost deaf. "You wanted to see me, Papa?" Papa straightened up slowly. "You're 17 years old, Andrew." I knew instantly what direction the conversation was going to take. "Yes, sir." "What do you plan to do with your life?" I wish his voice didn't have to be so loud, and mine in answering him, "I don't know, Papa." Now Papa was going to ask me why I didn't like smithing. He did. Then he was going to ask why I had not stuck with machine fitting, a trade I tried to learn during the occupation. He did that too. I knew that all Whitty could hear both his questions and the vague and evasive answers with which I tried to satisfy him. "It's time for you to choose a trade, Andrew. By fall, I want your answer." My father leaned back over his hoe, and I knew the conversation was over. I had then perhaps 2 months to decide on my life's work. Oh, I knew what I wanted all right, to find somehow a life that broke out of the mold, to find adventure, to get away from Whitty, from the mental set that was constantly looking backward. But I also knew that my prospects were not very good. The Germans had come when I was in the 6th grade and had taken over the school building, and that was the end of my formal education. The only thing I could do well was run. That afternoon I took off across the polders, barefoot, running mile after mile along the little footpaths used by the farmers. After 5 miles, I was just getting warmed up. I ran through the town where I had brought the firecrackers. My mind was clear now and functioning well. I scrambled up the dike that led back to Whitty with a mounting sense that I was close to my answer. The solution was clear. There was constant talk in the paper about armed rebellion in the colonies. The Dutch East Indies, so recently liberated from Japan, were now presuming to claim independence from Holland as well. Daily we were reminded that these colonies were Dutch soil, had been for 350 years. Why were our armies not reclaiming them for the crown? Why, indeed, that night I announced to the household that I knew already what I was going to do. "What's that, Andy?" said Martha. "Join the army." Mother's instinct was to draw in her breath. Andrew, she had seen too much of armies, must be always thinking of killing. But my father and brothers were of a different mind. The very next week I borrowed Papa's bicycle and pedaled to the recruiting office in Amsterdam. By nightfall I was home again, much diminished in my own sight. The army took 17-year-olds only in the calendar year in which they turned 18. I wouldn't be 18 until May of 1946. In January I was back, and this time I was accepted. Before long I was strutting through Whitty in my new uniform, oblivious to the fact that the pants were too small, the jacket was too big, and the whole effect quite top-heavy. But I was going off to take back our colonies for the Queen, and perhaps get a few of those dirty revolutionaries who everyone said were communists and bastards. The two words automatically went together. The only people who did not respond with applause were the Westers. I walked top-heavy past their house. "Hello there, Andy." "Good morning, Mr. Westra." "How are your mother and father?" Was it possible he didn't see the uniform? I turned so that the sun glinted from my shoulder brass belt buckle. from my shiny brass belt buckle. At last I blurted, "I've joined up, you know. I'm going to the East Indies." Mr. Wester leaned back as if to see me better. "Yes, I see that. So you're off for adventure. I will pray for you, Andrew. I will pray that the adventure you find will satisfy you." I stared at him, puzzled. Whatever did he mean? Adventure that would satisfy? Any kind of adventure, I thought as I looked out over the flat fields, stretching away from Whitty in every direction. Any adventure would satisfy me more than the long sleep of this village. So I left home. I left home emotionally as well as physically. I worked hard during basic training and felt for the first time in my life that I was doing something I wanted to do. Oh, how I liked being treated as an adult. Part of my training took place in the town of Gorkum. Each Sunday I would go to church, not because I was interested in the service, but because afterward I could count on being invited to dinner. I always enjoyed telling my host that I had been picked for special commando training in Indonesia. Within a few weeks, I would say, dramatically pushing my chair back and taking a long draw from my after-Sunday dinner cigar, "I shall be in a hand-to-hand combat with the enemy." And then, striking a somewhat distant look, I would ask if my host would consider writing me while I was overseas. They always agreed, and before I left Holland I had 70 names on my correspondence list. One of them was a girl. I met her in the usual way after church. A reform service, that particular Sunday. She was the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen. About my age, I guessed. Extremely slender, with hair so black it had a tinge of blue in it. But what impressed me most was her skin. I'd read about skin as white as snow. This was the first time I had actually seen it. After a pleasant snooze during the sermon, I went invitation fishing. Sure enough, I timed my exit just right. Snow White was at the door, and she introduced herself. "I'm Thyle," she said. "I'm Andrew. My mother wonders if you'd like to have dinner with us." "Very much indeed," I said, and moments later I left the church with the princess on my arm. Thyle's father was a fishmonger. His home was over his shop down by the waterfront in Gorkum, and throughout our dinner the pleasant smells of the dockside mingled with the odors of boiled cabbage and ham. Afterward we sat in the family drawing room. "Cigar, Andrew?" said Thyle's father. "Thank you, sir." I chose one carefully and rolled it in my fingers, as I seen the men in Whitty do. Frankly, I didn't like the taste of cigars, but the association with manhood was so strong that I could have smoked a rope and enjoyed it. Throughout the coffee and cigars, Thyle sat with her back to the window, the strong midday sun making her hair more blue than ever. She said hardly a word, but already I knew that this young girl was going to be one of my correspondents, and perhaps a lot more too. November 22nd, 1946, my last day at home. I had already said goodbye to Thyle and to the other families in Gorkum. Now it was time to take leave of my own family. If only I had known it was the last time I would see Mamma, I would have been far less of the dashing soldier going off to war. But I didn't know, and I took Mamma's embrace as my due. I thought I looked rather well. At last I had a uniform that fit. I was in excellent physical shape. My hair was cut close, army style. Just as I was ready to leave, Mamma reached under her apron and pulled out a little book. I knew right away what it would be, her Bible. "Andrew, will you take this with you?" "Of course," I said. "Will you read it, Andrew? Can you ever say no to your mother? You can do a no, but you can't say no." I put the Bible in my duffel bag as far down as it would go, and I forgot it. And the next part of the story is when he gets to Indonesia for the adventure. Hope you enjoy this. If not, wait till the next thing I speak about. God bless you.